Today, no one ever talks about polio outside of history classes. It is almost non-existent. People do not care because they are no longer affected by this disease, yet there is no cure for polio. How, then, did society rid itself of what was once a devastating nightmare? The answer is simple: vaccines. In the 1950s, Salk, a previously unknown scientist, transformed the medical world through the miracle of the polio vaccine.
In Vienna in 1908, Karl Landsteiner and Erwin Popper announced that the infectious agent in polio was a virus. In the summer of 1916, America's first major epidemic of polio occurred. It affected 8,900 people in New York alone, and across the U.S. it had afflicted 27,000 people, mostly children under 5. During this time, a baby died approximately every 2.5 hours. People assumed polio spread like most contagious diseases and thus quarantined infected individuals and cleaned public places regularly. In the early 1950s, about 25% of paralytic cases occurred in those 21 or older. The age distribution had changed in the span of about 30 years. FDR was paralyzed at the age of 39 and increased public interest in polio. It was spread now more by pharyngeal spread in the family, contacts, or amongst playmates, the secretions of the nose and throat. As far as the incidence in the early 1950s, in the 5 years before the vaccine was available in 55, about 25,000 cases occurred annually. The highest incidence was over 50,000 cases in 1953, I think it was, and this gives you some measure of the concern because it would crop up anywhere at any time without any forewarning. FDR. The illness started out harmlessly, like a cold or fever, but then pain began in the back, neck, shoulders, and legs. Muscles twitched and spasms contorted the body. Paralysis would strike a day or two later, damaging a muscle or muscle group's motor control, but leaving sensation intact. 3/4 of those afflicted would be confined to a wheelchair or a bed for life, and they became a generation of cripples. Paralyzed throat muscles impeded swallowing. A sip of water streamed out the youngster's nose or drained into his windpipe, causing him to sputter and cough. Unable to swallow saliva, he foamed at the mouth. Breathing gave way to gurgling. As his mother wiped the blood-tinged froth from his lips, he gasped for air, drowning in his own secretions. The struggle over, his eyes rolled back, followed by a few muscle jerks, and the mother held her lifeless child.
Jonas Salk was born on October 18, 1914. He was born to Jewish Russian mother who had immigrated to America when she was 13 and to an American-born Lithuanian father. His strict mother stressed education and early childhood experiences like World War I veteran amputees, coffins from the influenza of 1918, and crippled children on the playground, combined with his religious upbringing to make him eager to help people. However, his religion also prohibited him from pursuing the opportunities that he wanted. Prior to his research in vaccinations, he applied to several labs and was promptly turned down. In some instances, anti-Semitism played a role. I always realized that was always a factor. Every cloud has a silver lining, though, as Salk has stated that. My entering the field that led to work in vaccines came about as a result of my being denied an opportunity to work at another institution.
There are two great tragedies in life. One is to not get what you want, the other is to get what you want. And if I had gotten what I had wanted, it would have been a greater tragedy than my not getting what I wanted, because it allowed me to get something else. The principle that I tried to establish was really that it was not necessary to run the risk of infection, which would have been the case if one were to try to develop an attenuated or weakened poliovirus vaccine. And so it seemed to me the safer and more certain way to proceed. That if we could inactivate the virus, that we could move on to a vaccine very quickly. Whereas if you worked only with weakened virus, you'd have to demonstrate its safety eventually. So that was the reasoning. And there was a principle that was involved. You might say a scientific principle, a fundamental principle, choosing and preferring that which, the safety which you could control, and the quantities which you could use. So that this is, in a way, a more scientific approach, trying to work like nature instead of imitating nature.
By 1947, Salk had worked with Thomas Francis Jr. in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to develop a vaccine that would prevent influenza, and this proved that killed virus vaccines could work just as well as natural injections. Salk had also been testing adjuvants to enhance immunity. There was friction between Francis and Salk, as Francis approached the disease as an epidemiologist, while Salk approached it as an immunologist. And Salk was not a traditional academic. Founded in 1938 by FDR as the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or NFIP, the March of Dimes was created to combat polio. They found that a small percentage of American children from higher socioeconomic groups had antibodies compared to the lower socioeconomic groups, where half of the children had antibodies. A majority of children from underdeveloped nations had immunity. Babies from areas with poor hygiene were exposed to the virus while they still had protection from their mother's antibodies transmitted to them in utero. They experienced a mild form of disease, which was undiagnosed and would then acquire lifelong immunity. The NFIP funded various scientific research ventures, as well as ad campaigns that utilized famous actors and actresses. 1/3 of all March of Dimes funds within the first 8 years came from movie theaters. After the first year, the March of Dimes took in about $2 million, and 7 years later, more than $18 million had been collected. In 1947, a short film, In Daily Battle, which played on the audience's fear, was used by the March of Dimes. No child of that era will ever forget the haunting, eerie music, which played as clouds blotted out the sunshine and the shadow of a figure bearing a crutch crept across the countryside, passing over a group of boys swimming in a lake. I am very fond of children, especially little children. I feel very active today. I may even start an epidemic. In 1948, Harry Weaver, director of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or NFIP, invited Salk along with Kessel, Gebhardt, and Wenner to help determine the types of poliovirus. They made up the Committee on Typing, and this would allow them to consider making a vaccine. Salk had never worked with polio before, but this gave him access to laboratory equipment and funds. He had initially joined only to subsidize the costs of researching for the influenza vaccine, but he had become fascinated and obsessed with polio.
He said, "A young man, a great tragedy has just befallen you." I said, "What's that, Ed?" He said, "You've just lost your enemy."
Jonas Salk advocated for the use of a killed virus vaccine, as opposed to Albert Sabin's use of a live virus vaccine. Albert Sabin first gained an interest in poliomyelitis at Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, where he and a colleague were able to grow poliovirus in brain tissue from a human embryo in 1936. He was even awarded a grant by the NFIP in 1943 to conduct polio research in North Africa. At the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, he performed autopsies on everyone within 400 miles who had died of polio. Sabin felt that an oral vaccine would be far more effective, thus starting the Sabin-Salk hostilities. Salk wanted to make sure that this feud was not trivialized as two little Jewish boys from the Bronx fighting it out, but instead emphasized their different ideas.
In 1952 to 1953, the United States experienced a major polio epidemic. Thousands of polio cases inspired the March of Dimes to raise millions of dollars to find and produce a polio vaccine. Jonas Salk developed the first effective vaccine in 1952, but it required years of testing before it could be released to the public. Field trials were made possible with grants totaling $7,500,000 in March of Dimes funds. The vaccine was tested on 1.8 million children, known as polio pioneers. The vaccine works. It is safe, effective, and potent. Professor Thomas Francis Jr. announced to the world that Salk's vaccine was proven to be 80 to 90% effective in field trials on April 12, 1955. When I think of all the agony that these people will be spared seeing their loved ones suffering in bed, I must say to you I have no words in which adequately to express the thanks of myself and all the people I know, all 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the people in the world that will profit from your discovery. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Sabin Sugar Cube vaccine was developed a few years after Salk's vaccine was put onto the market. However, his vaccine was nowhere near as effective as Salk's and was therefore not as prevalent in its use.
The introduction of polio vaccines led to a decrease in the incidence of cases, and the last case of wild virus polio occurred in the U.S. in 1979. Global polio eradication may be achieved within this decade with the help of the Global Polio Eradication Program. The Pan American Health Organization led to the elimination of polio in the Western Hemisphere in 1991. As of 2012, only 223 confirmed cases of polio were reported globally, and a polio epidemic occurred only in 3 countries.